Once you have your blanks prepared, the next step in the process is to create a method to mount or hold your blank on the lathe, and that eventually will allow you to turn the inside and the outside of your bowl. Well, we're going to talk about 3 different methods that can be used safely to do this, and we're going to talk about them each in some detail. The first one we're going to talk about tonight is the screw chuck. As you can see, I have a couple of chucks here, and with them I have the screw chuck that fits this particular chuck. Most chuck sets come with one. They're used to mount your blank without needing the tailstock, although your tailstock is recommended. In order to use it, you have to put it inside the jaws of your chuck. As you can see, there's an edge inside there, and if you look at your screw chuck, what you will see is an edge around it, and what you want to do is clamp the jaws of your chuck inside that edge. Now, in order to make sure that it's mounted in the correct position, you'll also notice that there's some flat spots. Those flat spots are designed to line up with each of the 4 jaws on your chuck. So you open up your chuck sufficiently to allow the screw to go in between the jaws, and then you tighten the jaws down into that space that I pointed out. You tighten it up tight, securely, so it doesn't move. You make sure that the flat spots are pointed towards your jaws. Each jaw should have a flat spot mounted toward it, and that'll give you the best orientation so that it won't twist within the chuck. Now, the other thing that you need to be concerned about is the size of the hole. Now, each one of these screws that comes with the sets may be wider or taller depending on the manufacturer. In this case, I have Novichok here. I know that this particular screw is approximately 5/16. But what you want to make sure of is that you make a hole in your blank that is the correct size. Now, as you can see, there are threads all across here. What we are concerned about when we drill the hole is that it is no larger than the width of the shaft inside the screw. You want the maximum bite into the wood from the threads. So what we need to do is make sure that we have a drill that is the same size or smaller than the center shaft of the screw chuck. To do that, what I do typically is I take the end of it and I match the drill bit to the diameter of that center shaft. So once we have the screw chuck mounted in the chuck and we have it tightened up, you want to make sure that your blank is flat on top. It needs to be flat. The reason is that the screw itself is not what holds the wood. It is this flat surface on the chuck jaws. The wood is screwed down tight against it. The force is between the screw threads and that flat surface. So the top of your blank needs to be smoothed out, whether you use a chisel or a plane or some process, you need to make sure you have a very flat surface. So the next thing to do is to identify the center of your piece. In this particular case, I have a hole that I used when I used the template. Now the next thing you need to be concerned about is that you need to make sure that the height of the drill, or the depth of the drill, is the same as the height of your screw. If you have a chuck that has a long screw, then you need to make sure that you measured that depth out properly, because you want it to seat thoroughly on the surface of the jaws. So to make sure that I have it at the right depth, I'm going to take a piece of tape and I'm going to wrap it around the drill bit at the proper height. Plus a little bit, so that I make sure that it's deep enough. The last thing you want is for it to be shallow. Alright, so we will put this in the drill. You try to make sure that your drill is in a vertical position. Check around and make sure, and then go ahead and drill down to the tape. Now we have our hole. We can go ahead and mount it on the blank on the chuck. So the first thing I'm going to do is put the chuck on the spindle by holding the chuck and turning the hand wheel until we get it to lock up against the spindle. And you always want to make sure that your chuck is bottomed out against the spindle. Otherwise, you don't have good solid control of the chuck, and it might, if you have a gap, think about getting one of those nylon washers to fill that gap, or a rubber washer to make sure that it's tightly held against the spindle and the headstock. So now what we're going to do is we're going to mount this on the screw, and we're going to drive the screw in by turning the hand wheel and holding on to the blank, and keep winding it in until it makes firm contact with the top of the chuck jaws. Now, several people have demonstrated who basically turn the lathe on and drive it on and let go, but I don't recommend you do that, because it can lead to some problems, and you need to be an experienced turner to do that kind of thing. So now we have it pretty well mounted. I'm going to tighten it down to make sure there's good solid contact between the top of the chuck jaws and the blank. And now we have a good solid piece of wood mounted on the jaws, and that'll allow us to turn a tenon or a recess. Okay, so for the second option on mounting your blank on the lathe, I've laid out a series of face plates. And what you'll notice is that The face plates are different thicknesses. They have different hole patterns on them. This one happens to have 4 holes. It's pretty thick. This one has got 8 holes, and it's also a pretty thick piece of metal. This particular one is thinner. It has a thicker rim, but it's thinner in the center. It also has a slightly different hole pattern. The main point of these is that you need to decide which size you need. Face plates come in a range of sizes, and the prices vary accordingly, and it's always good to have several on hand. But if you have a big blank or a very wet blank that could be out of balance or whatnot, a good solid substantial face plate several inches in diameter is probably the way to go. If you have a smaller piece that is not out of balance, you know, a smaller face plate may be sufficient. The main thing is that when you mount a faceplate on a piece of wood, be sure to put a screw in all the holes. Make sure that you lock down every part of that faceplate on the wood, particularly if it's green wood. Now, what we don't recommend is we don't recommend that you use sheetrock or drywall screws simply because they're too brittle. They tend to break easily, and so if you see a screw that looks like this, I'll try to zoom in a little bit for you. Don't use it to mount a bowl blank. It's not safe. So what we do recommend is that you use a good solid stainless steel wood screw. You can either use Phillips head or square drive. I prefer square drive, but these happen to be Phillips head. Or you can use a good heavy panhead sheet metal screw. The main thing here is you have a good heavy thread. These do come in both square drive and Phillips. The other thing that you need to be concerned about is that when you put a screw in to the faceplate, you want to make sure that it extends far enough out that you have at least 7 threads in the wood. In this case, there would be more than enough. But if you have a thicker faceplate, you might have to have a longer screw in order to get a good 7-thread bite out of each screw. The one thing you don't want to do is you do not want to use short screws. They won't hold. If you have a particularly wet piece of wood or a piece of wood that's unbalanced, you want all the holding power you can get. So make sure that the screws extend at least 7 threads off the bottom of the faceplate. Longer is always safer, but it's not necessary to go too deep. Wood screws or good solid 8 or 12, number 10 or number 12 panhead sheet metal screws are a good choice. Okay, so I have about a 10-inch blank here. I've already marked out the centers, but it's always good find as close to the center as you can. There are commercial choices out there, but you can make your own if you choose. But if you have put a pinhole down here, there are jigs that can go down and find that pinhole and hold your faceplate in the exact center of the wood. But in this case, I'm just going to sight down over the center until I find the center of it. Now, this particular faceplate has a recess or a dovetail inside the screw to match the screw head. So in this case, I'm using a wood screw and not a pan head screw. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put one screw in, and I'm going to drive it about halfway down, because if I drive it all the way down, it might torque, and you don't want that to happen. So now I'll go to the opposite side. And I'll drive that one all the way down. Okay, so we have 4 screws in here, which is what this particular faceplate takes. I've used good solid wood screws in. They're well over 7 threads deep into the wood. And now I'm going to mount it in on the lathe. Now, to mount it, you hold it up to the spindle, and you set the faceplate on the spindle. Let me give you a better look at this. So in order to mount this faceplate on the spindle, it's best to push it up to the spindle and use the hand wheel to turn it. This will prevent you from cross-threading the faceplate on the spindle. And you keep doing that until you get it all the way up. Now, I've got it well on there. I'm holding the hand wheel and I'm turning the wood just to nudge it up. Now, one thing you want to make sure of is that if you have it, you lock your spindle and you give it a good twist in order to make sure that it's well mounted. And you see here that I have it well up against the spindle, so that there's a good point of contact right here. It won't come loose. You don't want it to. Now, the thing is with the screw chuck and the faceplate is you don't necessarily have to have the tailstock up against the blank, although for safety purposes it's always a good habit to get into as you're starting your initial shaping, to bring the tailstock up and put it into the blank just to hold everything secure. When you finish shaping and turning and you want to clear the last of it out, you pull the tailstock away and you'll be ready to go to finish off your tenon or your recess or whatever. So that's how you put a faceplate together. The final method that I want to talk about is using a 4-prong drive center similar to this. A lot of the lathes that you buy come with one, but you can buy them fairly cheaply. They also come in another form. This one happens to have a number 2 Morris taper on it, which will fit inside the spindle but there are also drive centers, spurred drive centers that literally screw on to the spindle on your 1 1/4, 1/8 spindle threads. So you can use either one of them, but the main thing is that you want to have pretty sharp spurs, pretty pronounced spurs. If these get dull or chipped off, you can try to file them to get the sharpness back on them, or just go ahead and buy another one, because you need to have a good bite in the wood in order to hold on to it and to turn it. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to kind of get an idea where my center of my bowl is, and I'm using a center finder. It's not going to be exactly accurate, but it's close enough for what I'm going to do tonight. I'm just going to take some readings here in different directions. So center is somewhere right around in there. Now this particular piece has its bark on it, so if you're going to do a natural edge bowl and you're using a green piece of wood, remember that underneath the bark is the cambium layer, and the cambium layer can be very soft in a piece of green wood. So you want to make sure that when you put your drive spur in, that it's solidly in the wood. If you try to do it just on the bark and drive it down on the wood right here in the bark, there's a good chance that it'll spin out, or it'll come loose and wobble. There's just all kinds of bad things that can happen. So what you need to do is to either take a chisel and clear off a piece of the bark, or in this case what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually use a drill, and I'm going to drill down into the wood at least the thickness of the top of this drive. That actually gives you a chance to get well into the wood before the drive spurs start to engage. So the first thing I want to do is get an idea of what the diameter of my drive is, and it looks like it's about 1 inch. So I will get out a 1-inch Forstner bit. I don't know that it has to be exactly the same size, but as long as it has enough space, that should do it. I could probably use a 1 1/16, and that would work just as well. So I'm going to approximate the center on this side. And as you notice, I'm drilling into the wood pretty well here. I want to get in there so that I'm into that cambium layer and maybe through it. That looks pretty good. So now what you could do at this point is put it in there and give it a few whacks. But if you do, don't use a hammer, because a metal hammer will mushroom out the end of this Morris taper, and you don't want that to happen. So either use a wooden mallet or a rubber mallet, and you can give it a couple of good sharp whacks and get it seated well, and that's not going anywhere. So now what you can do is bring up your tailstock and get rid of a few things here. And you can lock it in. And one thing you want to make sure of is that you don't have creep in your tailstock. So make sure whether you're going up or down that you lock it down pretty good. Now, what I have done in the past is take my wooden mallet and give it a good couple of whacks just to make sure it's well seated. If your particular tailstock goes down, you can take the butt of a tool, or you can take your wooden mallet and give it a couple of good raps. Make sure it's locked in tight. And then go ahead and squeeze it up. Make sure you have a good solid connection between the live center and the wood. And of course you'll have a good connection with your drive, your four-prong drive. Now, as you notice, in my particular case with this lathe, I have to be concerned because the motor is on the inside. So if I try to do this particular kind of mount, I'm not going to be successful. It's just simply a design problem that came with my lathe. But on a Powermatic or a one-way lathe, or any of the lathes that don't have their motor mounted up on top like this one, this would work fine. As it is, I'm well secured in there. The wood's not going anywhere, and I can go ahead and start to shape the bottom. Now, one of the things that I will point out that is an advantage to doing this is it's cheap. You don't have to buy anything extra. It's fast, and it gives you pretty good control over what you're doing. The other thing is if you have a piece of wet wood, as you notice, this is pretty thick here. If that happens to be full of water, or whatever, it may be very unbalanced. So in order to remedy that, you can take this and move the wood around. You can tilt it and change the angle that it's mounted on the wood, so you can rebalance it. Now, if you notice, I did manage to free up one side to spin all the way around. If you're in some sort of production situation and you don't want to spend a lot of time mounting plates or, drilling holes for screw chucks and that kind of thing, this is perfectly acceptable. If you watch some of Stuart Batty's demonstrations, he very often puts a blank in exactly this way. He goes in, he turns a tenon on the back side of it, he turns it around, and then he turns another tenon on the other side. So he can mount it, shape it, and then turn it around, mount it, and hollow it out. So that's the three principal methods that we recommend for mounting your bowl blanks, so that you can turn a tenon or a recess to mount it on the lathe. Each one of them is secure, especially if you, in the case of the faceplate or the screw chuck, you bring the tailstock up to secure it until you're ready to turn the center of it. However, you can turn the entire bottom without that, but it's recommended just for security. The problem with the screw chuck and the faceplate is that you need a little extra equipment. It takes a little extra time. Sometimes you have to drill pilot holes in the wood for each of the screws on a faceplate. You definitely need to make sure you have the right kind of screws, and so it could be problematic, but from a positive standpoint, it's a very secure way to mount your wood. With the drive center and the live center configuration, you can get a very secure mount. Again, you have to be sure that with green wood that you, and if you're going through the bark, that you make a place in the wood for the drive center to mount. Otherwise, it can spin loose and go flying off the lathe, and I highly recommend that if you're going to do it that way, that you practice a few times with some wet wood to make sure you understand what you're doing. And when you turn the lathe on, be sure to stay out of the way. Now, unfortunately, again, with my particular lathe, I don't use this because of the motor mount, but also you have to be aware that when you mount wood in this fashion with the drive center and the live center, speed is an absolute mandatory consideration. My particular lathe, the lowest speed it starts at is 450 RPMs. Now that doesn't sound like much, but when you have an unbalanced piece of wet wood on there, 450 RPMs is a very, very daunting speed. It'll shake and rattle and roll a lot. So if you have a bigger lathe and you have speed control, you don't have those concerns. But if you have a midi lathe or a mini lathe that's belt driven, you only have certain speed ranges that you can work from. So if you're going to use this particular method, be sure you take that into consideration. I hope that gives you a lot of information about how to mount your bowl blank prior to turning your bowl. If you have any questions, please let me know.